Hello and welcome to episode 7 of First Person Podcast, a monthly podcast put on by the editors of First Person Scholar. I'm Emma Vossen, editor-in-chief of First Person Scholar, and this month we're going to be changing it up a bit and talking more generally about rumors and controversy surrounding Nintendo. We have 4 editors with us today, including Alex, Rob, Chris, and myself. And in this episode, we're going to talk about Fire Emblem localization, Nintendo's lack of reaction to Gamergate, the launch of Miitomo, and finally, the rumors about having a choice of a male or female avatar in the new Zelda game. I'm Emma, and my Twitter handle is Emma H. Vossen.
I'm Alexandra. My Twitter handle is Alex G. Orlando.
I'm Chris.
I'm Rob, at Robot Parking on Twitter.
So originally we were planning on recording a podcast today about Fire Emblem, and it was really before any of the recent controversies surrounding Fire Emblem had really made it to sort of the front page of Twitter, let's call it. So basically, instead of having a podcast where we talk about how great Fire Emblem is, we're going to talk more sort of critically about Nintendo for the next hour today. Basically, I'm just hoping you guys can give me just like a 2-minute some of your thoughts about Fire Emblem if you've played it.
I'm about halfway through Conquest and I'm halfway through Birthright. I do not recommend that you play the game like this. I was really hoping to get my hands on a special edition, one that had the whole thing on the cart. The fact that that is not available in any kind of reasonable quantity is incredibly frustrating.
See our Amiibo podcast for our full rant about that general idea.
Yeah, and just in general, like, I found the game to be very sprawling. And I think there's a lot of really cool stuff in there, but I don't think it holds together the same way that Awakening did.
I've been playing through Birthright. I can't say how far I am through it. I like it better than Awakening because... No, actually, I don't. I have huge problems with the fact that half the cast are my relatives. And so if I want to choose a partner to have a baby with, that limits my options severely. Considering the relationships are such a heavy part of Fire Emblem and really makes me want to play those games over something like, say, XCOM or something else. I'm kind of bummed out about that. I'm creeped out by it. I don't like that I have to slap my husband awake every time I go to my house, which is the only remnants of the petting feature. It's weird. It's clearly missing some bits, and it doesn't all translate. I'm still enjoying it, but there's these little remnants of things that clearly should not be in the Western version that they just didn't.
Someone somewhere is like listening to your rant and being like, yeah, but it's about historical accuracy.
No.
Of course you could say
they have pink hair and purple hair naturally. There's nothing to be said. And really they didn't dye their hair like that way. Well, and the dragons and the other creatures. But yeah, you're right.
Yeah,
I have to remember.
Someone's thinking that somewhere, even though that's bullshit.
I did appreciate the side dimension, the explanation for why you wound up with an adult-aged child. I did appreciate that there was a bit more narrative conceit around that compared to the
And it's funny how suddenly when they're, say, like 8-ish, that they're okay to join the army. Before you kept them locked away and like my child's like, I missed you so much, I love you, and I felt so bad because it's like I'm a shitty mom. And then you're like, I guess you're okay now. And then like meanwhile he's running into the fight and gets shot with arrows left and right and you're just like, yeah, that's life.
So Alex, since you already sort of started hinting at this anyway, leaving for this moment the harassment of Alison Rapp out of it, do you feel like the controversy surrounding Fire Emblem is actually about localization at all?
I think that there is a certain obsession with having an authentic Japanese experience with certain types of games, whether it be because there's already this implicit hierarchy that Nintendo has been imposing all along about the Japanese market. And again, we talk about this in the Amiibo podcast a little bit. The Japanese market wanting a very specific experience and how the West does not want that experience when in reality, in some cases, they actually do. So for example, we like our Animal Crossing merchandise and we would buy it. But Nintendo as a body seems to not convey that. And I think the same thing applies with the types of games people want to play. If you think about, for example, the old Final Fantasy games were dumbed down for a Western audience. The instruction booklet was double the size because Nintendo seemed to think that, and Square seemed to think that the Western audience wasn't ready for this type of game. So there's always been this kind of, I guess, perceived condescension towards the Western market when it comes to certain Japanese games, especially with Nintendo. So I don't know if there's that history wrapped up in it as well. I don't know if there's a specific type of appreciation for some of the ways that Japanese games portray women and other sexual minorities, racial minorities, that it's almost like they're not good enough for it, and the West is perceived as kind of as a whole a sort of SJW, if you will, in comparison to what the Japanese people can handle as far as difficulty and content. So I think that it's really that, as opposed to necessarily explicit localization issues, which most people talking about it know nothing about.
I think you're definitely right that there is, I would say, like a construction in gamer culture. People will say like hardcore gamers, which is like as weird as saying casual gamers, because there's definitely like multiple types of hardcore gamers. And I think one of those constructions is this idea of someone who plays their JRPGs in Japanese, who, plays ROMs instead of the ports that you can get because they want sort of like an unlocalized product.
Well, and Dark Souls is a Japanese game, and that's considered right now the epitome of, like, hardcore gaming. Yeah. Air quotes.
Unfortunately.
I'd agree with a lot of what you were saying, Alex. I think there's a fair amount of holdover rage from past localization efforts Nintendo has made that are being kind of applied to Fire Emblem in a one-size-fits-all kind of sense. So that's not just really old projects like back in the days. The original Super Mario Bros. 2 was considered too hard for North American gamers, so they made something else and brought that over instead. Past Final Fantasy localizations, there's some of that, but also as recently as the Rainfall games.
Or even, like, not even talking about difficulty, the Dead or Alive Extreme 3 issue is still fresh in everybody's mind, right?
So there's this tension that Nintendo fans bring to the table when it comes to what Nintendo of America is even going to deign fit to release stateside. And I think a lot of people are getting lost in the mix and trying to distinguish between whether a game's going to come out at all and whether they're going to live without a boob slider.
When you look at some of the concessions that certain Japanese developers have had to make in the face of, like, the successes of Western franchise games. There's a really great piece that Leigh Alexander wrote about the latest Metal Gear that talked about how they had to start moving towards like more of an open world model and pay a little bit more attention to design acumen from the West when you see something like Call of Duty, which kind of deploys a lot of the similar paranoia, but is a lot cleaner, is a lot less weird, is a lot less nuanced or strange. Like, the Call of Duty is not trying to do any of the critical work that Metal Gear Solid purportedly is. I guess, yeah, like, I'm agreeing with both of you. It'd be interesting to have a dissenting voice that there's a feeling that, like, gamers have kind of been done wrong. But, like, on the one hand, I guess for me, it's never been easier to get a hold of Japanese content, and it's never been easier to learn Japanese yourself. Get a Duolingo account. PlayAsia is super happy to, like, cater to your new neo-reactionary rhetoric till the cows come home, and also overcharge you. Or you can go to, like, Amazon Japan, and for me, like, looking at this bullseye that's been kind of placed on Alison Rapp, I'm still not sure that this is actually about localization in and of itself. It's not, don't bring these games over, it's don't change these games in this one particular way. Yeah. Which harkens back to, Austin Walker's Why We Write, and, like, the idea of, like, there's a spectrum of influence. It's not just, like, video games appearing from on high in the minds of Japanese developers, and then it's like getting tossed to a bunch of jackals with dyed-colored hair.
Well, you are hitting on something big here, which is like a fetishization of Japanese culture, a fetishization of Japanese game developers, and, like, I think to an extent now that everything's so accessible, a fetishization of Japanese sexual culture? Because I think, Chris, you used the term holdover rage, which I think is really appropriate to sort of what we're seeing, because I think this sort of fallout is maybe what we're seeing is a tipping point of holdover rage from years and years and years of incidents involving localization, involving a competition between the US and the Japanese market. And I think some of that rage, like a lot of times, does specifically boil down to issues around how sexuality and how sex is depicted. There are some games, Japanese games, that have been sort of deemed unlocalizable. You look at controversies that happen when people discovered Rapeplay, which is sort of a rape simulator game. There's a whole series of these types of games in Japan that are really common. And when people from North America first saw Rapeplay, they were like, dear God, what is this? Or, Love Plus, which is sort of a, I don't want to demean it, but like a girlfriend simulator, which is one of the most popular, maybe the most popular DS game in Japan, but like they said, just wouldn't work here. So, like, do you think there is something happening with Fire Emblem because there's a sexual component, a family component, that this sort of fetishization of Japanese sexuality is part of what's happening here?
Yeah, so basically what happens in Fire Emblem is that, so there's two major, removals that happened. Number one is the lesbian conversion scene or character storyline. where essentially a lesbian character could not fight in battle because she was so distracted by other anime titties. Can I say that? You can cut that. And so you essentially needed to drug her and then convert her into a straight lady for her to be able to become a formidable fighter. And people had huge problems with that.
Jesus Christ, I didn't even think I heard about that. That one.
Yeah, really was found out initially because there was a script that was leaked. And so people translated it and found this scene that happened and screenshots and everything. This happened a while ago, and so that was a huge issue, and that was taken out. And then the second thing is that there was a relationship mechanic where and again, it's not even relationships at this point, but essentially you have a house and you can every so often invite a select few characters into your house, and they walk into your house, and then the perspective shifts to their face, and you can actually scroll down a bit to their chest, and they say a line like, "Oh, it's so nice hanging out with you," and there's some degree of friendship to even slightly suggestive. And then you can take your stylus and rub their face, which increases your relationship level with them. So how the Western version is that they just come visit, and then it's and you don't rub their face, and they say their thing, and then they're on their way, and then it says relationship improved with character.
There have been other, some of the more committed anti-localization efforts have tried to skirt around the no, we're not horrible sexists. Also, no, we just want better writing. And it's okay. So they held up different dialogue they translated, and they said this has just got memes in it. And it's okay, that's a fair critique of some writing, but that also misses the point that, and I think a lot of those anxieties are coming out of not just you took away my anime titty, but also
is that the title of the podcast?
You took away my anime titties.
You took away my anime titties. I mean, at least you've got your anime titty mouse pad,
That's true. Is this Alex?
No. What?
No, I don't. You guys all know what I'm talking about, right?
She's just saying in general.
Just in general. I'm imagining every guy who's really upset about localization has one of those anime titty mouse pads.
And they do have butt ones, too.
Butt ones.
But
I don't want to yuck anyone's yum. If you like your anime titty. All of the anxiety is just coming from the idea that you don't want your games to be changed or influenced in this particular direction. It's a business decision made to a wider audience in the West. What it basically suggests to the people that are even just concerned that, oh, you're just putting memes in this dialogue, or you're changing these characters or whatever, is also that you are not our target audience in the same way that maybe you have been in the past.
Or your behavior is considered too deviant for the West. You know what I mean?
Or
your interest in this particular mechanic, which to say it's not true, and people shouldn't be offended by that, because, it's a very natural thing to be attracted to sexual elements in some games. But when you're dealing with a game where there are, I would say, and again, the age is always blurred, they never tell you the age, and it's always a 12-year-old body, but on the profile it's 18, and Honey Pop and that shit. But they're clearly 12-year-old girls, or a little girl on the farm that's lost all her family, and you take her in, and then you start rubbing her face. I'm not, that's not for most people. So you know what I mean?
There's a really
what narrative is that, right? What are you trying to...
Yeah, so
that's going to translate differently in the Western culture then. But I did want to bring up the Janine Hawkins article for Giant Bomb on skinship in particular. And one of the things that she does is really, really good is, first of all, contextualizes it in a way that's not just hey, this is this creepy, face rubbing thing. And it's more talking about, it is kind of awkward, but it's also intended to kind of foster, a kind of identification. This is an attempt to bridge some kind of human contact with this digital creature.
A nurturing aspect.
Yeah, a nurturing aspect of it. Really does a lot to kind of add a lot of nuance to the discussion of, I would have been fine with some kind of skinship in there. I'm not, personally I would have just been okay, I'm just going to wait for this thing to do its business and okay.
Or choose whose faces you want to rub.
Right.
And I understand too that there's a cultural crisis in Japan right now where human intimacy is lacking, and there's very much different kinds of things in Japan to help remedy that aren't digital. You have places where you can go and pay to cuddle with someone for half an hour or something like that, and that's completely normal and accepted because there are those things that exist in Japan that do not exist here, and it's not a sexual thing, it's an intimate thing that is lacking in that culture. So of course you're going to have those built into your games if they're a more normalized aspect of your culture. But for a Western audience, people don't know about that necessarily, and it's going to come off in the wrong ways, and they just don't want the West perceive Japan as this kind of thing when they don't understand.
I want to introduce kind of a counterpoint to this argument that some fans have brought forth about this is an inauthentic version of the game. Lots of RPGs, in particular Japanese RPGs, get what's called an international version. And what that usually means is there's a little bit of additional content, there's more skins, there's bug fixes. It's a better version of the game that's come out through that localization process. And more often than not, that international version of the game will get re-released in Japan so that Japanese consumers can double dip. Where's the rage about inauthenticity there? Why aren't people mad that they're not getting that original, authentic, broken version?
What it comes down to it's because it's all conceptual. Like, they're not actually worried about getting an authentic version of the game. It's this sort of fetishization of the sort of hardcore JRPG gamer.
Or this fear of DLC season pass culture that we're always skeptical. Was it always on the disc? And they're taking it out to charge us more later. We were never getting the full version, it seems, of a game when it's cut off, and there's so many air quotes in my hands right now, when it's cut off from initial release and it's being sectioned off later for you to pay another $40 for, and people are always, as consumers, very conscious of that and wanting to make sure they get the value for their dollar. So maybe that's another reason, right?
Yeah. There's also a parallel, like, again, we've kind of been dancing around the Alison Rapp stuff, but Rapp herself wrote a piece talking very much about wanting to kind of preserve Japanese culture from Western imperialism. Take that what you will, like one way or the other, Gamergate or other people aligned with them certainly use that essay as a stick to attack, or at least, nudge other bodies to intervene and come at Nintendo.
The huge irony that is Gamergate attacking Alison Rapp for an essay where she talks about sort of protecting Japanese culture, while somehow blaming her for wanting to erase Japanese culture, getting angry at her, which she didn't do, about the boob sliders of certain characters being removed who are underage, but at the same time calling her a pedophile. And so this conspiracy rhetoric is like, it is that empty. It's empty enough that it completely contradicts itself if you just know enough about the scenario.
As academics, I think we have a very interesting perspective in this Alison Rapp issue, because undergraduate research papers are kind of like the thing we never ever look at ever, because not only are they a time when you have no idea what you're doing, but they are framed based on a particular class and based on a very particular assignment. We do not know what that class is, to my knowledge, or what the particular assignment was. So to say that this is purely her original thoughts and ideas is to, I think, in a way overestimate Alison Rapp based on an undergraduate class assignment, and I think it's a little unfair to judge her based on that, because I hope they're all deleted from my computer, because it's a work in progress.
Right, which is why I wonder if this has anything to do with localization and more to do with trying to grab the industry by the lapels and forcing it back into their corner and saying, like, we want to still be your guys. Except that the success of video games is such that it's getting the same problems that any other popular media is receiving, and that it has to cater to a more diverse market.
So if Gamergate is kind of like, I don't know, Nintendo's angry first ex-boyfriend, who's like, take me back, come with me. What Nintendo did was dumped their current girlfriend, and we're like, yeah, alright.
What Nintendo is what Nintendon't.
Yeah, well, here's the thing, is
or
like,
I'll go with you to prom, but then we're broken up.
But then we're broken up again, yeah, like it's almost like this token gesture. So I guess what I want to ask is, we know what Nintendo did, but like, what could have Nintendo done that would have made us happy in this scenario? Because I think all of us saw this scenario as sort of a microcosm of a general fear we have about the games industry. What happens if the games industry does become sort of an arm of Gamergate?
It was honestly heartbreaking to see how Nintendo dealt with this, because I think all of us here in the room are hardcore Nintendo fans and always hoped that Nintendo had these kind of particular ideals against the sort of vitriol that Gamergate spews. Nintendo is what I thought the Disney of video games in the right way, but it turns out they're also the Disney of video games in the wrong way, which is this idea that you have to uphold, air quotes, family values, and even having something like a tattoo and working for the company is seen as very taboo. It's only very recently that Nintendo has allowed some places at Disney World, mostly Disney Springs, which is their boardwalk area for those employees to actually have tattoos. Yeah. So it's very, very conservative. But at the same time, also, when Gamergate happened initially, so many companies spoke out, kind of even near the end, a little too late, to be honest, about how horrible this movement is, and they didn't even dare speak the name. God forbid. Yeah. And Nintendo stayed silent throughout that whole thing. There's journalists and people affected that are deeply connected to their company.
Not even your employees, just your fans. I think you could describe my apartment as like a Nintendo shrine. I'm such a huge fan, but it was like one of the first things ever that made me stop and be like, maybe I should close my wallet.
If you've listened to our Amiibo podcast, it's only gotten worse.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I said I was done then. I'm not.
No. None of us were. We were just lying to ourselves.
So, like, there have been some really interesting articles written about the culture at Nintendo and how it is not necessarily the level of Konami towards the end of Metal Gear Solid, where, you know, if you said something on social media, you might want to find yourself making pachinko machines downstairs instead of developing a game. But also, there are people who, especially on the Giant Beast cast, there were some people who've had interactions with Allison, and they found her presence to be like a heartening thing. I think it was Alex Navarro that brought this up. Because finally that company was allowing people that worked for it to kind of be themselves in some way, shape, or form. I think for Nintendo, they're allergic to the idea of controversy. That doesn't exonerate them. I think the PR message that they sent out was brilliant as someone who understands rhetoric and PR. In that it did exactly what they wanted to do. They wanted the current controversy that they've been dealing with since November to stop happening. They wanted their name to stop being associated with Gamergate. They wanted Gamergate to stop tweeting about them. And so they fired the person that had been targeted by them, found a different reason, and just kind of banked on the idea that everybody else will just kind of move on with their lives. That thankfully kind of hasn't happened. It's continued to go, and IGDA actually issued a statement I think last week, which is like, hey, maybe you could have done this a bit sooner, but what it did do is extend that an extra news cycle or whatever, and that's probably something PR people at Nintendo sat there and like, fuck, man.
And I feel like I should add the additional level of being not just Nintendo that she worked for, but the Treehouse division, which had this sort of cultural reputation for being a place where Nintendo fans went to work for Nintendo as essentially professional Nintendo fans. Those jobs were sort of coveted in a way that it's just like you were kind of becoming a professional fan. Mm-hmm. And I don't think after this, those jobs are going to be coveted in the same way. Yeah. Like, to answer my own question based on everything we just said, I guess what we wanted was essentially Nintendo to speak out about Gamergate instead of trying to just sort of muffle the controversy with a pillow. Do you think anything of it had to do with Miitomo? This was all sort of happening like right before they were doing this huge step into a new market. If that hadn't have been happening, maybe they would have dealt with it differently.
If you're a marketing department, you only have so many bodies, you only have so much time and attention. Miitomo has a fair few social media hooks. The last thing you want is a couple rogue hashtags floating around.
Well, that's what I wonder. Like, if Nintendo had to spoke out against Gamergate, like a week before Miitomo came out, and then all those Gamergaters, I don't know, what, flood all the questions they're being asked with answers about Gamergate, or...
I would hope so.
I feel like there would have been some sort of consequence that they would have been unfavorable for them.
No, instead Miitomo was flooded with Nintendo. Why did you fire Allison Rapp? What's up with your shitty employer practices?
I did do that for like at least as many questions as I could make it fit.
Yeah, and literally everyone on my... not that long, but still long enough, Miitomo friends list had at least something snippy to say about how Nintendo's handled this entire situation. So I don't see how this is a great deal better for them.
Yeah, because I did see a lot of people, too, who stopped and were like, am I even going to download this app because of this? And I mean, I think if we had to pay for it, I don't know if any of us would have bought it. But because it was free, we all were like, well, maybe. Like, I feel like, at least from my perspective, I've maybe got what I can get out of it. Is that how you guys are feeling?
Probably given Nintendo enough of my personal information through this app alone.
Yeah.
I've given them a lot of false information about myself.
Yeah. Personally false.
I guess the other question is, even if we collectively are like, okay, we played this for a couple weeks, it's not that interesting anymore. If they are making $40K a week on this app and no one in this room has spent a cent... Did you see those statistics?
No, I didn't see how much they were making.
Yeah. How do you even give them money through that thing?
I don't know, right? But I think this is another thing that we've come up against before where, we're talking about casual games, talking about Candy Crush and stuff, and people are like, yeah, but I've never spent money on Candy Crush, or I've never paid to play, or I don't buy cards in Hearthstone, and people will say these things, but it's like, but people do.
And maybe we're just not the demographic for Miitomo.
Exactly.
Like, maybe this is like, a parent might look at this and say, hey, I don't want my kid on Facebook, but maybe I'll be okay with them doing Miitomo with their friends.
But I think you're right, that like there is something there. I don't think we are the demographic, despite the fact of being, like, as you said, like, intense Nintendo fans.
Mhm.
I don't think they want Nintendo fans. I think they want everyone else.
Well, and I just saw that YouTube has a kids app too, so it's just like these devices are now working towards getting like family friendly devices because they want children to adopt technology much earlier in their lives.
To sort of bring this full circle, do we know if there was anything different about the slightly earlier Japanese version of Miitomo?
There is kind of a peripheral link, because the last quote-unquote big controversy Nintendo had to wade through had to do with Tomodachi life.
Right. You couldn't have same-sex relationships.
I thought there was a bug that allowed you to have same-sex
Oh.
relationships in the
Yeah,
Japanese
because that was,
version.
yeah.
And then they patched it out. So the public got angry about that for, I hate to say this, but the right reasons. But I don't want to make like a value call on what Nintendo is doing there, outside of the fact that they have proven themselves again and again to be horrible communicators, no matter what side of an argument they fall on.
Their point is they don't want to be in an argument in the first place.
Yeah.
So that horrible communication is just them, as unsubtly as possible, like, searching for the door in that argument's house party and, like, breaking the window if they need to.
And I think that's the problem with talking about Nintendo as a company, is it's like, you know, if you imagine that the big three gaming companies in consoles are like political parties, Nintendo will always be this sort of umbrella party. They don't have an agenda they're trying to further. They're just trying to like cover the most ground. You can't really appeal to this is the right thing to do, this is the wrong thing to do, because it's just like who's the most vocal, who's the majority, who's the demographic. And maybe that's true of every company.
There's a bit of an irony there.
Yeah.
Because the way you lay that out, Nintendo probably can afford the most to stand up against Gamergaters, because they cast their net so much wider than that quote-unquote hardcore niche.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, their bread and butter for the last 10 years or so have been non-gamers, casual gamers, people who don't necessarily identify with hardcore gaming culture, but enjoy games.
I think you are hitting on something specific there of like why it made everyone so mad that it was Nintendo specifically. It was partially the idea of the family values, but it was partially this idea that if Nintendo's main consumer is not the hardcore gamer, then why are you firing someone on behalf of the supposed hardcore gamer army? I guess the other thing that's been in the news related to Nintendo in the past month or so has been a lot of the rumors surrounding the new and forever delayed Zelda title for the Wii U. This is something I've been tweeting about a lot lately, because one of the rumors has been that there might be the choice between a male and female avatar. And I think I went through a reaction that a lot of people did with that, whereas I initially was like, thank God, finally. And then I was like, oh no. And I think because of a lot of the stuff we've been talking about, I realized that that's not necessarily a good thing, because it'll probably be terrible.
For me, I was just like, nah, it won't happen. I don't have any faith anymore.
Yeah, that was
You know what I mean?
reaction.
My faith is shattered.
Even though they did it in Pokemon.
It's
But
hard.
at least with Pokemon, the character changes every time. It's a different
Right. Yeah.
person.
Right.
Yeah.
I would also add that it is harder to overtly sexualize a 30 pixel high sprite, whereas there's just all kinds of like
Potential.
The optimist in me wants to say, why not, and why not 3 games ago?
Right.
Not because it's going to make a huge difference to me personally on a gameplay level what gender link is, but like, look at someone like BioWare, who recorded 3 games worth of dialogue with 2 different actors, so you could have a male or a female shepherd throughout the entire playthrough. The stakes are so much lower to do something like this in Zelda, where Link is basically an uncharacter with no
doesn't
personality
talk.
whatsoever.
Yeah.
So there's really no gender inflection going on there at all, aside from a couple more recent games where they tease the Link Zelda pairing just a little bit.
Yeah.
But even then, like, what's stopping keeping that with a female Link?
I guess I really hope that Nintendo was paying attention when that news article broke about the person who hacked one of the Zelda games to just switch Link's gender. And it was just like a find and replace. It was still a coherent story. It still made sense. I really hope that they just sat there and they went, okay, this is an easy fix. We create a female avatar, and that's That's probably expensive, according to Ubisoft, so...
God, I forgot
Yeah,
about
that's right.
that.
I feel like part of me hopes the Nintendo saw when people were doing those hacks and those mods, but like another part of me hopes they didn't, because like the most recent one was actually a mod of Twilight Princess, where it wasn't even made so that Link was a girl in that game. It was just all the you, kid, they, that was all changed. And that was really cool, and I think for me that's sort of like the ideal scenario, that they sort of make a genderless pronouns. I feel like I'm prepared for this, but I could not believe the comments on it. Worse than if they had switched it to a female Link, because I think there is this idea that like the idea of taking gender out of the scenario, even for a hyper-androgynous character, is the most SJW thing you could do.
You're not just attracting the people who are like, no, Link's a boy, Link's a boy!
Yeah.
You're also attracting the people who just hate political correctness in all its forms.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it makes them feel bad for that.
Well, here's the thing, too, is like, if they're gonna do that, they're gonna make it as marketable as possible. So, for them to do subtle changes, like changing pronouns and maybe slightly changing the appearance of Link, it's not gonna fly. They want it on the box art, they want a Linkle type, where it's just this complete different character, or they're gonna do maybe Zelda. Yeah. But I don't think we're ever going to get subtle, androgynous, ambiguous. It's not going to happen because it's not going to be marketable.
Even before this rumor or any of the mods or anything, like, there was a reaction to the very first trailer they showed at E3, I don't know, what was it, 2 years ago or whatever?
5, probably.
And the reaction to that first trailer was people were like, holy shit, the new game stars a girl Link. Because the androgyny is so high that people just saw that trailer and were like, oh, it's Girl Link.
Which is interesting, because they've kind of done the opposite thing with Sheik over the years.
Yeah.
Right? They've made Sheik more and more overtly coded female.
Whereas, like, when I first played Ocarina of Time, like, you didn't just thought it was a guy.
The reaction that has emerged in response to this idea of female, the negative reaction at least, Jim Sterling did a couple of episodes back where he talks in a similar way about the invincibility mode that's in Star Fox Zero. Quote-unquote concessions like this that are completely optional and introduced into games are received by this niche hardcore crowd as intrusions into their private clubhouse.
Yeah.
The idea that more people can enjoy these games who aren't them is perceived as a threat.
The thing is, like, Dark Souls 3 just came out, and there was, as there always is, there's always a talk about, like, having an easy mode or adding some kind of like assisted thing. It's like, I play a lot of games. I spend a stupid amount of money on games. I'm actually starting at a point where like I don't have the time, so I'm not buying them. But a mode where I could just like go through something and play it at my own pace and get through it, just because I have a lot of other shit in my life that I need to deal with. I need to be an adult at some point. That's not just appealing to people who are new to it or whatever. It's to people who also just don't have time or room in their lives to get the proper experience. Because at a certain point, I need to eat.
But at the same time, even though this is, like, optional and could be really beneficial, especially for people like us who are really busy, that statement that you just uttered is, like, the exact same statement that Jennifer Hepler uttered, what was it, like 8 years ago or whatever. People started threatening to kill her kids over it.
Yeah.
Because, like, that's the exact sort of thing that really bothers them for some reason. This idea that anyone might not be playing the authentic version of it.
Or they just don't want to shoot people.
To respond to that 2 minutes ago comment, I would just say that Dark Souls is a work of fucking art, and anything that gets more people in the door to appreciate that is good in my books.
And to see the whole game, and not just like the first level and then giving up because it's hard, and rightfully so.
I do find it interesting how Undertale has been the most recent game to really be sort of taken on as like a, oh my god, look at this, by that sort of hardcore gaming audience. And we talked a lot last time about how Undertale can be kind of inaccessible if you don't have that gaming knowledge, if you aren't going to get the jokes and that sort of thing. And we also talked about in our last podcast how you have a genderless, gender-ambiguous avatar there. So that's a new IP, so maybe gamers are more open to that. But why is that okay, but having genderless Link would not be okay?
People didn't grow up with Undertale, and they didn't grow up with Frisk. Frisk is the name of the character in Undertale. They didn't grow up with Frisk, and so therefore you cannot tarnish what was never established as something else.
In a way, though, they did grow up with it, because, like, Undertale is every game you grew up with. I like to talk about it as, like, Earthbound fanfiction. If anything, there's like a lot to be tarnished. Maybe there are tons of people who are very angry about.
But if you think about nostalgia, it's very literal. It needs to be there or not. Not a reinterpretation, not a reimagining, not a Nolan-esque for some things, or a Bay-ish.
Yeah.
You know, if you think of something like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
I feel like also Undertale is quote-unquote is an indie game on Steam, which comes with a massive amount of expectations and baggage. The commentary on the Super Hot Steam forum, when the game kickstarted, it was like $14 or $15 to back the game, and when they finally released it, it was like over $20. People were losing their damn minds. It was like, oh, it's only 2 hours for the campaign, even though they have like an endless mode and a bunch of other stuff in there, and it was like a really well-crafted game. So like Undertale is also not a retail release. It's not a real game in the same way that Zelda is. And it does come with that historical baggage, but it also just comes with those material difference of distribution and all that stuff.
Yeah, and you'd be surprised how many people have not heard about Undertale. I don't think it's as big as we think it is.
Yeah.
Like,
I think that's hard to imagine, but yeah, like I think we are in a very specific community.
At the same time though, there are the haters, right?
Yeah.
Undertale has been called an SJW game. People lost their fucking minds when it beat Ocarina of Time in the Game Fest.
Oh yeah, God.
Game of the Year, Game of All Time, or whatever poll.
Proof positive that there is a feminist Illuminati manipulating GameFAQs results.
GameFAQs sells it off.
To what end?
I didn't know what beast I was feeding when I was literally printing off Final Fantasy Tactics FAQs in 2001.
I believe you that there are people who think of Undertale as an SJW game. That really, I think, shows how broad in the spectrum of politics and games we've gotten, where I'm just like, how could anyone think that? It's a great game and it's so cool, but it has so much appeal for the hardcore gamer. But like, have we gotten to a point where there's like a hardcore social justice gamer? And is that us? I think so.
Oh, goddamn it.
Right?
Everyone just looks at Rob.
Why am I getting looked at?
Like, because I think I started this off saying there's all these different types of hardcore gamers, right? There's this, there's this Japanese hardcore gamer. There's this, FPS hardcore gamer. There's this RTS hardcore gamer. There's this MOBA hardcore gamer. Where are we our own group of hardcore gamers?
Yeah, I guess as someone who just plays a lot of, tries to go out of my way to play a lot of small and weird niche things, I think there's a valid point there.
I think it brings us back to that 2011 argument that Bogost brought up. At the end of How to Do Things with Video Games, he talks about eventually gaming is inevitably going to get so ubiquitous that we're not going to have gamers and non-gamers anymore. Mm-hmm. Basically a slower burn version of the same thing Leigh Alexander said 2 years later and got shit all over for. Yeah. Right? It's gonna happen. Games are continuing to expand. More and more people play them. Are we gonna get to a point where we can just, drop this fucking hardcore versus casual argument?
I think we are gonna get to that point. I also think we're not there yet. I am one of the only people I know who hasn't completely dropped the gamer label, and part of the reason why I haven't dropped the gamer label is so I can aggressively force in people's face that I am both a feminist and a gamer. And I think that's because as much as it would be nice to drop the gamer label, clearly we aren't there yet. And I think we will get there, but it's gonna be dirty.
One of the problems is that you have entire marketing and PR firms that have crafted and have a vested interest in tapping into this idea of a gamer identity.
A gamer market.
A gamer market that is this monolithic thing. And it's not. In reality, it is not, but they've somehow created this thing. And it's a monster that they created, which is, I think, in part why the industry itself is afraid to speak out against this stuff.
Thank you for listening to the First Person Podcast. We would like to thank Neil Randall and the staff at the Games Institute for their support, as well as Elise Vist, our podcast producer. We would also like to thank Stephen Trothan, who wrote and composed our theme music. You want me to start? Hi, I'm Emma, and you can follow me on Twitter at Emma H. Fossum.
Hi, my name's Alexandra. You can follow me on Alex G. Orlando.
I'm Chris. I don't follow my Twitter-ness, so I don't know.
That's your introduction now, Rob. Just you laughing into your hand.
At Robot Parking on Twitter.
God damn, you got that.
Can we restart? Do you want to just
We can do it again.
The disapproving shaking of the head.
Please.
That's where the end is at the end.
Yes.
Edit around that at least. Try
just the least thing.
Put it on your CV. We'll do it live.
Okay.